Quorum Radio, baby. Quorum Radio, baby. Without further ado.
Hey, you sound good.
Good, great. And Dale, you're, I understand, a 40-plus year veteran of radio and TV. You've been at the home, very much at home in the world of computer animation. Somebody who's at the beginning of that, I suppose, and one of the pioneers for applying it to the JFK assassination for many decades. You were honored with 4 Emmy Awards for your work in this field. And you're somebody who can be considered a very reliable and talented freelance character animator living in Michigan. Has created performance art for a variety of clients around the country for over a quarter of a century. You're a writer, producer, and a director. And again, Dale Myers is somebody who wrote what I think with much reason we can call the definitive work on the death of Officer J.D. Tippit with malice, Lee Harvey Oswald, and the murder of Officer J.D. Tippit. So I wanted to ask you, with that as a background, and I hope you're doing well today, Dale, but I wanted you to let us know a little bit more about this person who's probably the one forgotten victim of November 22nd, 1963. Tell us about who J.D. Tippit was. If you could, please.
Well, hi, Bill. J.D. Tippit was he was a farm boy. Grew up in East Texas in the Clarksville area, Red River County. Ended up about age 18, 19. We were in the middle of World War II. He had a farm deferment because they harvested cotton, and cotton was a needed crop for the cotton industry, for uniforms and all kinds of stuff. So it wasn't they sought out a deferment, it's just that they said, no, kid, we need you back on the farm. So a lot of his buddies and that were joining. You know, he was kind of left on the farm, and by at the end of 44, he decided that he felt like he was being left out of the fight, so he went down, he joined the Army, went to boot camp, Camp Walters, and then volunteered to be a paratrooper, which is a pretty incredible thing for somebody who's 19, 20 years old. Trained at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and eventually was shipped at the very beginning, the early part, February of 1945, to France. Ended up jumping into the Rhine Valley as kind of a mop-up operation after the Battle of the Bulge. So it was right toward the end of the war, the last few months. Did see combat and ended up getting injured. He was a 50 caliber machine gun ammo bearer, and got hurt his knee when he was carrying the ammunition, and they signed him up for a Purple Heart, and he refused it, which I think shows a little bit about his character. Sure. Anyway, he was discharged, went back to the farm, back to Clarksville, and intended to be a farmer. Married his high school sweetheart, Marie Gasway, and they started to carve out a life as a farmer in Red River County. And then in early 1950s, in 1952, there was a series of droughts that kind of took a toll on his farming efforts. And there was a neighbor of his that had become a Dallas policeman and recommended that, you know, with his military background and so forth, that he apply. And he did. And eventually they moved to Dallas. He became a police officer in 1952. And by 1963, at the time of his death, he was an 11-year veteran, had several commendations. One particular incident in 1956, he had come across a guy who was wanted by the FBI in another state, and the guy was drunk in a tavern, and he ended up pulling a gun on JD, and he and his partner ended up shooting the man, and he was shot and killed, and it kind of took a toll on JD, but he got a commendation for that, and there were several other incidences. But he was basically happy with being a patrolman and, you know, happy with his life with the Dallas Police Department. Very proud of being a Dallas police officer.
Yeah, and by the way, didn't it happen that in that incident in the nightclub with that suspect that was wanted by the FBI? Didn't it happen that he pulled out a gun and he pointed it at JD to shoot and it misfired?
That is correct. And according to, I talked to Elmer Boyd about it, and Elmer had come through police training school with JD at the same period of time. And as he told me, he said that the suspect had the wrong kind of ammunition in the gun. He couldn't remember whether it was center fire and it should have been a rim fire or vice versa. He said he had the wrong ammunition in the gun. That's why it didn't fire. But I remember JD told one of his brother-in-laws that he said the barrel of that gun pointed at me looked as big as a stovepipe. And, as you can imagine, but that was the exact words that he said. He said it looked as big as a stovepipe. And you can imagine the fear and so
like
forth.
That at all.
No.
Your senses are hyper sharpened when you're going through a moment of let's say of potential doom. So, well, fortunately, thank God he survived that. So, bring us to November 22nd, please, 1963.
So on the 22nd, he was covering District 78, and that was also his call number. And 78 was in Oak Cliff, at the south portion of Oak Cliff. So let's say south of and below central Oak Cliff, which is where he ultimately was shot. And then the Trinity River would divide Oak Cliff. So think of Oak Cliff as kind of a section or a suburb, if you will, of Dallas. And then downtown Dallas was right across the Trinity River. So he was probably 5 or 6 miles south of the downtown area, and running his patrol as normal. He things were kind of slow, and around 11:30 or so in the morning, he decided to shoot home for lunch, and got there and had a quick lunch with his wife, which turned out, of course, to be their last. And his older son Alan had actually come home from school sick, but he later revealed he faked it because there was an exam that day. So, he was 13. so he said he was sick. So he ended up being home and having lunch. And then his daughter, JD, had 3 children. His daughter, Brenda, was still in school. And then the youngest, Curtis, hadn't started school. So he was home. So the 3 of them, the youngest boy, the oldest boy, and Marie, were home for this quick 20-minute lunch. He checked back into service about 10 to 12, around the time that President Kennedy was landing at Love Field and getting that huge welcome. And then JD went back on patrol, went back to his district. And then, of course, the shooting happened at 12:30 in downtown Dallas. A lot of squads in the downtown area, all the downtown units were ordered to Elm and Houston, the scene of the Texas School Book Depository. And you hear on the, I'm sorry?
Hundreds of police and law enforcement.
Yeah, there's quite a number of them. And so you hear the dispatchers, and we have the police radio transmissions that were recorded at the time. And so you can hear them, the orders being given. And then they would call the outer units to come in a little bit closer to kind of cover off the districts that were now empty. And they could also respond, if needed, to come downtown as well. But they could also cover, any other traffic accidents or things that might happen. And so JD Tippit was ordered to move into central Oak Cliff, which put him in between his own district and the downtown area, so that, again, he could be in a position to respond. As a matter of fact, his former partner, so the guy he used to ride with, and JD would train other rookies as they came through, and one of them was Murray Jackson. And Murray Jackson at that time was now the dispatcher. And so Murray, at 12:45, he ordered JD Tippit into that area, and a few minutes later he says, "Are you in the central Oak Cliff area?" And he reported Lancaster and 8th, which was just a little bit, a couple blocks north. It's what would be called central Oak Cliff, which would be Jefferson Boulevard. And Murray said, "You will be at large for any emergency that comes in." And you hear Tippit kind of dryly say 10-4, and a lot of conspiracy theorists kind of latched onto that, and later on, suspecting that because of what happened. Of course, J.D. Tippit it ends up in an altercation with Lee Harvey Oswald and gets killed. And so people thought, well, that was kind of mysterious. Why did he say that? Why did he single Tippit out? Well, it turned out I had spoken to Murray Jackson a number of times. I talked to a lot of police officers in the I was going to say in the preparation of my book, but actually I just interviewed him because I was interested in the case. I later wrote a book and included all this stuff. But Murray told me that about it, that he was actually referring to an incident that happened between he and JD back when he was a rookie. And I put this in the book, and the story was, and this kind of explains what that message was about. But the story is that one of the first nights that Murray was on his own. So he'd been training with JD for a while. Now he's on his own with his own partner, and they end up corralling a couple of rowdy teenagers, and they were in the back of the police car, and all of a sudden got out of control. And the teenagers were bouncing around and roughhousing, and Murray kind of panicked, and he jumped on the police radio and asked for backup. Well, JD was in the area, and he kind of shot over there. By the time JD got there, within a few minutes, well, they had subdued these teenagers, and they were had them outside the car. And Murray said JD comes rolling up and jumps out of his car, and Murray said, I told him, it's cool, JD, it's cool, everything's cool. And so JD kind of chided him after that. He says, one night you're out on your own, and I got to come and save your life, So he kind of razzed him. It was just an inside cop thing, He kind of jazzed him about it. So Murray told me that on the day of the shooting, on November 22nd, after he had ordered JD into that area, that's why he made that remark. He said, he will be at large for any emergency that comes in. He was kind of, chiding him back, so much like the previous incident.
Sure.
And he said, Murray told me that he says, I plan to, later on kind of, hassle him a little bit about it. He said, little did I realize what was going to happen, of course, but that was why. And when you listen to JD's response, he kind of dryly says, yeah, 10-4. So, they got it. They got the joke. But apparently conspiracy theorists, it's one of those things they jumped on.
Sure.
Anyway, so you would like me to continue?
Sure, absolutely. So tell us about exactly what brought him down the street and what reports he had received concerning suspects to be on the lookout for. Wasn't that what basically happened? They gave him they put out a bulletin to available units concerning a male.
That's right. The description of the suspect wanted in the presidential assassination attempt, because they didn't know the president was dead at that point, had been actually put out at 12:45. So the first description goes out on the police radio about a minute before Murray orders JD into the central Oak Cliff area. And it's kind of a vague description: white male, 30, 5'8", 160 pounds, carrying a lever action rifle. Not like I guess you'd expect somebody to be walking down the street with a rifle, but that's what they had. So that was the description. And Tippit, as the story goes, Tippit ends up on 10th Street, which is it's a residential area, and 10th Street is one block north of Jefferson Boulevard, which would be the main drag that goes through the Oak Cliff section. And so while Jefferson Boulevard had a lot of lights on it, you could cruise parallel to it by one block down 10th Street and not have any lights. And so it was kind of I think that's kind of the reason he was on 10th Street. It just made it easier for him to cruise. So the way the witnesses described it is that J.D. Tippit is driving down 10th Street very slowly, 10, 15 miles an hour, and he spots a young man walking down the street. Now, this young man's going to turn out to be Oswald, according to 11 witnesses who ID'd him later in lineups and so forth. And Tippit comes up behind him. Now, we could talk later about the direction of travel that Oswald was reportedly heading, but at the time J.D. pulls him over, they're traveling in the same direction. Tippit's coming up behind him. So the chief witness was Helen Markham, who was a waitress on her way to catch a bus over on Jefferson Boulevard. She ended up having to stop to let the police car pass in front of her on this side street. So for a minute, how you kind of watch when the police car's in the area, you kind of watch, see what happens. Like when a fire truck rolls up, everybody stops, see what's going on. So she sees the patrol car stop. She sees Oswald walk over to the passenger side, and he leans down. Now, we know the JD's in a squad car. It's a Ford Galaxy 500. They used to have, for people not familiar with cars of those period, there was a triangle-shaped window, a vent window that was cracked. Now, the window on the passenger side was rolled up, but the vent window was cracked open. So Oswald walks over and he leans down, and they appear to have a very brief conversation, probably not more than 10 or 15 seconds tops. Nobody heard what was said. But whatever was said, Tippit gets out of the car. He starts to walk around the front of the car. Apparently, Helen Markham thought, oh, he's going to talk to him. And as he got to the left front tire, Oswald suddenly straightened up, stepped back a couple of steps, pulled a gun out from underneath his jacket, and fired several shots across the hood of the car, striking Tippit 4 times and knocking him to the pavement. Oswald then fled the scene. He was seen by a number of people over the next several blocks as he fled, and emptying the gun, putting it back in his belt, and so forth. And so the shooting happened at approximately 1:15,
Right.
according to the police radio, and there's different things that point to that particular time.
Right.
And you know, once Oswald left the scene, and people started coming out of their houses and so forth, and it took a few minutes. People were phoning police, but it took a few minutes for there was one guy passing by, T.F. Boldy, who pulled up, and he saw Domingo Benavides, who was an auto mechanic that also was near the scene. He's in Tippit's patrol car trying to use the radio, and he didn't know how to work it. Yeah. And so Boldy took the mic from him and then called the dispatcher and notified police of the shooting. Of course, all this was happening at the same time that citizens were calling for their homes. So as Murray Jackson told me, there's a conveyor belt that comes underneath a glass window. So you have police operators answering phones in another room. There's a sheet of glass between them, and they'd write down, disturbance in the 500 block or whatever, and they put it on a little sheet, and it would go down this conveyor belt, and it would come past the dispatcher. He said, I grabbed this call sheet as it came by, and he says, I started to read it, disturbance in the 500 block, and all of a sudden the citizen came on the radio. So it's all happening at the same time. Wow. And of course police rushed to the scene. Of course, the police officer had been shot, which, nowadays police are shot all the time. But in 1963, that was a very rare occurrence. In fact, if you go back and look, the police officer shot prior to Tippit was 7 years before that, and after him was another, I think, 10 years. Wow. But long periods of time. Without a shooting of a police officer. Amazing. And a lot of the cops thought the shooting was connected, but some people weren't sure. When I say some people, reporters and so forth that were going to the scene weren't sure, is this connected to this assassination attempt, But they thought, well, we better cover it anyway, something's going on. Yeah. A lot of the police thought, well, it's got to be connected, I mean, it's such an unusual situation. And Tippit is shot like 2.5 miles and 45 minutes after the presidential assassination attempt. So a guy on foot could have walked that distance, could have walked 2.5 miles in 45 minutes. So it's certainly within the area of a possibility of it being connected.
Sure. So anyway, and by the way, police... let me just have a quick question, Dale. Oswald at the scene of the crime of J.D. Tippit being killed, did he leave any evidence or anything at all at the scene of the crime? Bullets, shell casings, or? Yeah, he had a .38 caliber revolver when he was arrested, and the revolver used .38 special shells. And Oswald was seen unloading the gun at the corner house, 2 houses from where he'd shot the officer, unloading the shells, and they did find 4 shells in that immediate area, in the bushes and along the side of the house. Those shells were later proven to have been fired in the revolver that he had in his hand at the Texas Theater when he was arrested, to the exclusion of all other weapons on the planet. So there's absolutely no question that the revolver that Oswald had in his hand, that he pulled on police officers attempting to arrest him at the Texas Theater, was the weapon that was used to murder J.D. Tippit. Right. And so, and by the way, were they able to pull any, I want to also ask you about the whole wallet issue. Were there any prints that they could pull off of the car, off of the shell casings, anything at all that connected Oswald? Well, they attempted to they dusted the car for prints, because Helen Markham said that he might have, she saw him lean down, he might have put his arms or his hands on the car.
you know, and in those early moments, you're not sure, you know, so you just do it. So they dusted the side of the car. The police later said the prints were of no value. I took it upon myself to get a high quality photograph of those prints that were taken, which were in the police files, and I put them in front of a Michigan State Police fingerprint expert prior to my book coming out, because I wanted to find out, were these really of no value? The one set of the prints looked kind of clear. I thought maybe the cops overlooked something. So, but I put it in front of him. He checked it against the fingerprints they took from Oswald and determined that the prints were the legible print he was able to look at was not that of Oswald. And I said, well, what does that mean? He says, it doesn't mean anything. He asked me, he says, was the car ever secured? I said, no. Police didn't get there for a few minutes, and there were people using the police radio, and we know they took Tippit's gun and put it on the hood of the car and then moved it to the seat. I said, you know, and he
how
says,
many
well,
bystanders, you know, how many bystanders do you think were there at the scene of the crime with J.D. Tippit?
By the time police got there, you know, not that many, but probably 7 or 8, you know, 7 to 10, something like that, somewhere in that neighborhood. I mean,
and then how many cops?
How many
law
cops?
Enforcement? How many cops and detectives and others that showed up at the scene of the Tippit?
25 to 30 easily.
Wow.
25 to 30 that are on the police radio, and there were quite a few that didn't even use the radio, just went out there. So there's quite a few people. The bottom line is Herb Lutz, who was the fingerprint expert that I got to do this analysis, said, well, it doesn't mean anything. He says the garage mechanic could have touched the side of the car earlier that morning before the car went out. He said it could have been anybody. So the fact that it wasn't Oswald's didn't mean it. If they'd have found Oswald's prints on there, okay, then it would have put him at the scene. But the fact that they didn't find Oswald's prints didn't mean that he wasn't there, right? You'd have to turn to other evidence.
That's not here nor there. Let me ask you a question. Was Oswald's wallet found or anything like that? Did that happen also, or is that not true?
You know, it's a long story. I go into it in my book. It's actually a whole chapter. The short of it is that in 1996, James Hosty, the FBI agent who was in charge of the Oswald file, told a story that he got from a fellow agent, a guy by the name of Bob Barrett. And Bob Barrett had been out at the Tippit shooting scene, but he had told Hosty over dinner, you know, years before, that while he was at the scene, Captain Westbrook was there, and he had a wallet in his hand, and he asked about some IDs in there, and he said, do you know Lee Oswald? Do you know Alec Heidel? And Barrett told Hosty, it didn't mean anything to me at that time. I just said no, and that was that. He says, and then of course later we find out the rifle is traced to Oswald, and he ordered it under the assumed name of Heidel. So Barrett says, so clearly, you know, they found Oswald's wallet at the Tippit scene. It's a slam dunk. He obviously killed the cop. Now, what Barrett didn't know is that two things. He didn't know that Oswald's wallet was actually taken out of his pocket after his arrest in the patrol car on the way back to City Hall. And secondly, he didn't know that there was a film that was shot by a television crew, a local television crew, that shows police at the Tippit shooting scene. And in one of the shots, they show police handling a wallet. Now, I knew about the footage, and when I read the story, I thought, oh, there might be film evidence supporting Barrett's story. And I thought, well, this will show that Oswald dropped his wallet at the scene. Maybe he was handing it to Tippit, or who knows, you know, but here's a wallet. So I called Bob Barrett, and I worked with him for several months, and we tried to find corroborating evidence that supported the story. Well, the first thing I did was I arranged with the National Archives to get Oswald's wallet out of cold storage and photograph it at the same angles that it was filmed. This wallet on the film shows up. And I was able to determine that although the wallets were similar, it clearly wasn't the same wallet. And I went and talked to Paul Bentley, who took the wallet off Oswald in the arrest, after the arrest in the car. And I told him the story. He said, oh, it didn't happen, Dale. You know, I'm telling you, I took the wallet out of the... So I traced the whole pedigree of Oswald's wallet, and I call it the arrest wallet, the wallet that came out of his pocket after his arrest.
Sure.
And then I tried to track down, well, where did this wallet at the scene come from? And basically, it kind of shows up, and somebody turned it in to police at the scene while they were looking for evidence. So
Second wallet.
it looks like somebody found it somewhere, and and I went back. It wasn't around the car, so wherever they found it, it was somewhere close enough, I guess, that somebody thought it might be connected, but it wasn't in the immediate area of the shooting.
Right,
and then of course
that particular. Yeah, one second, just to clarify. So that particular wallet found near the scene of the crime was that had the A. Hiddell documents in it, right? That's what.
No, it didn't. No, see, this is the whole point. The point is that once I realized, well, the wallet with the IDs, the Hiddell IDs and Oswald's ID, that's in Oswald's pocket at his arrest.
Okay, right, okay.
Okay, so then it gets down to, all right, so what's the evidence that the IDs are in this wallet that's at the scene? Well, the only evidence is Bob Barrett's 30-year-old recollection that those questions were asked of him by Captain Westbrook while he was at the scene. So then I worked with Bob and we went over. He says, I thought I put it in a report. So I found his 302 report. It's not in there. I talked to a fellow agent of his who said that Bob was known for putting all kinds of details in his reports that other agents wouldn't.
Meticulous.
Things that weren't necessary to the story, but yet here was this a key element now that he didn't include.
Yeah.
And then he said, well, maybe I testified to it in 75. No, he didn't either. So there was no contemporary record. Then I did find out that Barrett did go back. He went to the Texas Theater. He was there for the arrest. After they took Oswald back to City Hall, he went back with Captain Westbrook to City Hall. And at that time, Captain Westbrook did see the wallet, and Bob Barrett was there. And so I asked Bob, I says, is it possible that the questions, in fact, weren't asked of you at the scene, but were asked back at City Hall when we know the wallet with the ID is actually there and Westbrook has it? In other words, I thought maybe Bob's just messing up, the recollection.
Yeah, sure.
And, as you know, and as anybody who's told a story, I go back to a story. I used to tell a story about when I was a kid. In the summer, we'd go out to my grandparents' cottage. And for years, I told this one story. And then one day, like 30 years later, one of my cousins who was there said, that's not what happened. And she started to tell me, well, here's what happened. And as she was saying it, Bill, I realized, oh, my God, she's right. I now remember, that's what happened. I've been telling it wrong for 30 years.
Sure.
And I was convinced in my own mind that I was right. So I think, to be honest, Bob was a great guy. We worked very close with this. He had an opportunity to read the manuscript of the book before it was published, so he had a chance to change it and add any corrections. And I had to, of course, he wasn't happy that the way I came down on it. I basically said, I think he's mistaken, because I think the evidence, that's what it shows. There's no other conclusion you can come to.
Right. So what do you think it was?
And of course, I knew, I'm sorry.
No, I want to quickly ask you. So the thing is, was there in fact a wallet found nearby, or do you think maybe that was misremembering?
Well, there's a wallet on film. There's absolutely no question there's a wallet on film. But the wallet on film is not the wallet that was taken from Oswald after his arrest. So there's a second wallet. There's another wallet. Now, the conspiracy folks have had a high old time with this ever since 1998 when I published this story. And all the stuff that you read online, every single bit of it stems from my book, from the work that I did originally on that story. And of course, it cheeses me off to no end that it's been twisted and bastardized to the point where I don't even recognize it anymore. But of course, and here's the thing, Bill, while I was working on that, I was working with a friend, and I said, the conspiracy folks are going to have a field day with this. So we immediately started to think, okay, so what are they going to say? And we thought, well, they're going to say it's a plant, of course. So we're thinking like conspiracy theory. All right, so it's now. So how do we prove that it is or is not a plant? So I went at it with that idea. Let's find the truth about this. If we can knock down this, or maybe we'll find out it is a plant. I didn't know. I knew it was an interesting part of the story. But here's the one thing that's interesting is Bob Barrett thought that the wallet was Oswald's and proved that he killed Tippit. So on one hand, they would now want to champion, oh, Bob Barrett was right. He did see the wallet, but they want to ignore the fact of what he thinks that meant. And they want to instead say, well, but he was right about seeing it, but it was really a plant. Sure. And the bottom line is nobody knows the pedigree of that wallet. I thought it might have been a witness's wallet, or for a while people thought it was Tippit's wallet, but that was all eliminated.
Right, but nobody. Sure. One question though, Dale, was that so nobody actually saw? Did somebody actually testify that they saw a wallet fall out of Oswald's pocket near the scene of the crime as he fled?
No, and all the radio and television guys who were there never reported it. Can you imagine if they had Ron Ryland was filming it. Now he said, "Oh, this is the police officer's wallet," and the officer also had Tippit's service revolver, and he kind of got him flipped around. He said, "Well, it's the gun it was the suspect's gun in the police officer's wallet." Well, it was actually the police officer's revolver, which got me to thinking, well, maybe it's the suspect's wallet then, right?
Yeah, sure.
The reverse.
Sure.
But here's the thing. If they'd have found Oswald's wallet at the Tippit scene, that would have been all over television and radio that night. It would have been all over. And the cops would have loved it. Can you imagine? We found the suspect's wallet right there at the scene. It'd be a done deal. But yet there's not a single report, Bill, not a single radio or television report. And so that begs the question, well, then apparently it had nothing to do with it. Somebody turned the wallet in.
Had anybody ever reported there was something inside of it?
Well, no, we have nothing. Now the story came out later. Kenneth Croy was a reserve police officer, and he later stated that an unknown person gave him the wallet and also the pistol was turned over to him. Now we know Tippett's pistol was actually commandeered by Ted Calloway, an eyewitness, and he grabbed a local cabbie and then went driving around looking for Oswald. They were going to throw down on him and do a citizen's arrest. And I know
that was another time. I mean, let me tell you, it was another time.
Yeah. Well, Ted Calloway was a Marine. He was I was going to say a former Marine, but there's no such thing as a former Marine.
Yeah, of course.
Right?
Of course.
He was a Marine in World War II. He fought at Iwo Jima, the Marshall Islands. I talked to him, and he was still the same when he was in his 80s. He said, Dale, picking up that gun off the ground was like picking up a stick to me. It didn't mean anything. He said, I grabbed it and I tried to get that cabbie to find him. And I said, well, what would have happened if you'd have found Oswald? He says, I'd have thrown down on him. And I says, well, what if he wouldn't have cooperated? He says, I'd have shot him. And I believe he would have. But as it turned out, he ends up, the police caught up with them driving around and said, they took the guns. You got to go back to the scene. So they end up coming back to the scene with the pistol. So somewhere along the way, this wallet is turned in. And of course, we know there were some shells found by Domingo Benavides, and then later the Davis girls found some shells and so forth. So people were scouring the area, picking up anything that was laying around. And somebody might have picked up a wallet and turned it in. It might have had nothing to do with anything.
Sure.
So the bottom line is there's no wallet in that. There's no second wallet in evidence,
Wow.
And there's no pedigree to the wallet. Interestingly, when I finally talked to Kenneth Croy before his death, and I asked him about the wallet, he says, well, there were 7 IDs in it, but none of them were Oswald or Heidel. And I said 7 IDs, and I said, so now I'm thinking, well, the guy's either misremembering or he's just flat out making this up. And I said, well, no, wait a minute. If there were no IDs to Oswald, you're the one that, the conspiracy folks are saying you're the guy who believes that this was Oswald's wallet left at the scene. How did you connect the wallet to Oswald if his ID's not in it? He said, well, I just assumed it was his because whoever gave it to him said the suspect might have dropped this. And because the suspect later turned out to be Oswald, he said, I just assumed it was Oswald's wallet. Yeah, so that's how things can get twisted and assumed and so forth. Especially and then as Bob Barrett, of course, said, he never saw the wallet. He never saw the ID,
Sure. Great. And so the question I wanted to backtrack to, first of all, there were no prints at all on the shell casings at all? I don't know that they even dusted the shell casings. I've seen this more recently where why didn't they dust the shell casings? He was seen
2 eyewitnesses saw him
Yeah.
removing the shells from the revolver with the cylinder open and dropping him, and then they're later found right there where they saw him doing that. I don't know why you would need
Yeah,
his
sure.
fingerprints on him to prove that he handled them. It doesn't make any sense. And my understanding is shells can or cannot, or sometimes don't, contain fingerprints. It doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, sure. Now, how many blocks away or how far away was Oswald's rooming house from where J.D. Tippit got murdered? Got
It
shot?
was 9/10 of a mile.
So I've seen people make a big deal about that. They
I know,
charted
but anybody who's been
out.
down there and has walked it knows you can walk it. You can walk it in about 12 to 13 minutes, and we don't know that Oswald didn't flat out run. Nobody knows the direct route that he took, but it can be done in about 12 minutes. And I've heard people say, well, the time would have been really tight. It's like, well, yeah, he didn't just show up and now he's standing around waiting to shoot a cop. I mean, of course the time is tight. It's going to be the exact amount of time to get there, and then the shooting happens. I mean,
Sure. And by the way,
So-
there was a point, excuse me, Del, where Oswald was walking, is aware that J.D. Tippit's that a police car is approaching him. What happened? Didn't he change direction?
Well, that was my speculation. I'm the first one, as far as I know, that came up with this. And it was all because in reading the eyewitness testimony, prior to my book, Mark Lane and others, would say, speculated that, look, there's these eyewitnesses that say he's walking west. And the Warren Commission said he was walking east. If he's walking west, he'd have to have gone someplace beyond where the shooting occurred and then be coming back. The time would be, so outrageously long that there's no way he could have been killed. That it should exonerate him automatically.
Right.
So they would, and then they would point out, here's all the witnesses that said he was walking west. Then, of course, the Warren Commission is saying, no, here's the witnesses that say he was walking east. So in looking at the two, it occurred to me one day, I thought, well, what if they're both right?
Yeah, sure.
And so I started looking. I noticed that the witnesses that said he was walking east, which were Helen Markham and Bill Scoggins, who's the cabbie sitting on the corner, neither of them looked toward the police car that's pulling over to the curb until the event starts to happen. In other words, they didn't even look over and notice Oswald until the police car is pulling over. That's what Helen Markham initially said. Now, later she changed her story and that she saw him earlier and so forth. But the initial story is the police car is what attracted both their attention. And as they followed it over the street, they see it slowing down, and then they see a guy walking the same direction as the car, which is east. But you had, 3 or 4 witnesses earlier that said, no, he was walking west. He was coming from the other direction. And so it occurred to me, well, what if they're both right? What if Oswald is walking west? And I figured out where he would have to be when he spots Tippit's patrol car, and then what distance, if he switched direction right there and ends up getting pulled over, 3 doors down, where would he have been when he switched direction? And I figured out it would have been just before he got to the last house. So Scoggins wouldn't have seen him. Helen Markham wouldn't have noticed him. And it would have only been, he would have switched direction, saw Tippett's approaching patrol car. And that seemed to make some sense to me for a couple of reasons.
Sure.
First off, Oswald has been away from the book depository for 45 minutes. Unlike everybody else, he's not listening to the radio or watching TV. He has no idea what's going on. He doesn't know if someone saw him in the window. He doesn't know if his employees have already turned in his name and said he's missing. The police could be out looking for him. See, he doesn't know any of this. So when he sees the patrol car coming, it's what you call consciousness of guilt. His actions betray that he is afraid of something. So he turns and changes direction. And while a lot of people, initially the Warren Commission said that Tippit stopped Oswald because he fit this meager description. And of course, Mark Lane and a lot of others jumped on that saying, oh, come on. The description was so vague, Tippit would have to be stopping everybody in Dallas practically.
But what kind of reaction?
The description.
I mean, there's some speculation that I think the rhetorical questions that maybe need to be asked that are fair, and that is that when Oswald spoke to Tippit, did he give a sarcastic response? Was he asked a question? did Oswald act just like a normal person, or did he act kind of have a reaction that was a little bit suspicious? You know, why would he leave the car?
Actually, that occurred to me, and I talked to Murray Jackson. He told me an interesting story that ties into exactly what you're talking about. So back when Murray and JD were partners, early 60s, Murray said he was driving down, it turned out to be Beckley, as a matter of fact, in Oak Cliff. JD's in the passenger's side, and he says, as we're driving down Beckley and we pass this one residential house, a brick house on the corner, JD says, hey, pull over at the next side street. And Murray didn't know what he had seen or what had happened. He pulls around the corner. He says, JD jumps out of the car and goes up to the porch, and there's a kid up on the porch of the first house there. And by the time Murray said I parked the car and then I joined him, he says, JD's already up there talking to the kid, and they ended up arresting the kid. He had a gun on him. And JD later told him, I saw the guy make this overt move, kind of duck his hand behind his back or something. And that's cops spot stuff like that, right? So I think that the about face is what caused Tippit to initially pull over. All right. Now, I don't think anybody else believes, based on what happened, that Tippit suspected that Oswald was the presidential assassin. I think he just saw something suspicious. He pulls the car over. Now, here's an interesting thing that occurred to me. Oswald had to have double time to get over there. So to cover 9/10 of a mile in 12 minutes, he'd have to be practically running or certainly briskly walking. Now, he had the zipper jacket.
Here. One quick thing. Look, Oswald at the time of the shooting was, let's see, who was what, 24?
Yeah.
Former Marine. My son was a Marine. And preparing him to be a Marine meant a tremendous amount of running, a lot of stuff. So a lot of physicality at that time as well. I mean, we're talking about a guy who's probably in pretty good shape. I don't know if he kept in good shape or not. He wasn't somebody who was overweight, apparently, at least according to the photos. What's the big deal? I mean, for him to make a 9/10 of a mile, we're not talking about a guy in the 60s.
No. I agree. He certainly could make the distance. My point is that he still had the zipper jacket on, and it was 68 degrees out, which means that he probably was sweating. So when he leans over in the car, maybe his hair is wet, he looks sweaty, and I'm thinking that maybe Tippit sees that and thinks, that's odd. Why wouldn't you just take off your jacket, right? I mean, if you're so hot, you're sweating, why wouldn't you just take off the jacket and carry it over your arm? Why has he got the zipper jacket on? And so I'm thinking maybe something like that, or something that Oswald said, sarcastic or something, perhaps, because it was a 10-second conversation. I think Tippit gets out simply to investigate further. And we know that Domingo Benavides was approaching. There was some traffic coming, and I think Tippit was distracted to get out around the driver's door, get it closed behind him, and then kind of skirt along the side of the car there, so he doesn't get hit by the oncoming traffic. And I think just those couple of moments, he's not looking at what Oswald's doing, and of course Oswald's pulling the pistol. So JD did pull his pistol out. It was underneath his body. No shots were fired, but I think he was probably drawing the gun more as a reflex action.
Sure. How consistent were the descriptions of the suspect, the person seen that shot JD Tippit, and the man found in the Texas State, Lee Harvey Oswald? How similar? Was it identical? Were there any discrepancies?
No, they were pretty. It was close enough. I mean, some people were all over the map on the jacket. Some people said it was brown. No, it was light tan. No, it was gray. No, it was white. Some said he had a light-colored shirt and dark slacks, or the reverse. So, but in terms of the eyewitnesses, we know Ted Calloway picked, and he's the used car manager that absconded with Tippit's revolver and chased after Oswald. But when Oswald was fleeing, he was less than a block from the scene, and he's got the gun in a raised pistol position. And Calloway's, he doesn't know if he's a detective or what. He just yells, "Hey, man, what the hell's going on?" And Oswald kind of stopped and shrugged his shoulders and said something Calloway couldn't understand. And then Oswald kind of realizes, I'm drawing attention to myself. So he's kind of briskly walking instead of running, and he's trying to jam that gun into his belt. Well, Calloway observed Oswald pass him about, the width of the road, so 56 feet or so. I think they measured it later. And that night, Calloway goes down, before he saw Oswald on television, goes down and picks him out of a lineup. Absolutely, positively, that's the guy I saw fleeing from the scene. And I'll tell you what, out of all the witnesses I talked to, Ted Calloway was rock solid. I talked to him several times over a 15-year period. He never really varied the story, other than a couple of minor details or things. You know, he was in his 80s when he died, that you would expect over time. But as far as his identification of Oswald and what happened, he never really varied from the story. I thought he was a supremely good witness. I would have convicted Oswald on his testimony alone, although, you know, you want physical evidence, of course, and there was. But just in terms of eyewitnesses, if he was the only eyewitness, it would have been a done deal. And so here's the interesting thing, Bill. There were something like 11 eyewitnesses that either saw the shooting or saw him fleeing the scene. And we know that each one of those people pick up the suspect as he's running. So Calloway sees him run until he gets to the corner, and then you got somebody else, oh, I saw him from that corner to the next corner, and so on. So the thing is, you know, a lot of conspiracy folks have tried to shoot down each eyewitness. But the bottom line is, we know they're all seeing the same person. It's not like, you know, a guy materializes and then disappears and he's replaced by a completely different individual. So if any of those 11 along that route are positive that that's the guy, well, then they all saw the same guy.
Right. So and let me. Okay,
and I
question.
think Calloway was solid on that. So.
Dale, what was the distance between the scene of the Officer J.D. Tippit shooting and the shoe store in the Texas Theater?
It's about 6 blocks. So it took Oswald about 20 minutes to go the 6 blocks. And I've heard people say, well, no, wait a minute. It only took him 12 minutes to walk 9/10 of a mile, but then it took him 20 minutes to go 6 blocks. It's like, well, first off, you got, you know, a lot of police cars pouring into the area. So you're not just strolling down the street now. You're slinking from one garbage can to the next, and you're trying to get your way down there. So it makes sense that it would have taken him longer to get there. But he got down to Hardy's shoe store, and as the story goes, people familiar with this story, there's a shoe store manager, Johnny Brewer. He's about 20, and he sees Oswald step into the vestibule, and it's very clear that Oswald's feigning like he's looking at the merchandise because his police sirens are ripping behind him. He kept looking over his shoulder, and the shirt's out because he had ditched the jacket that he was wearing. The shirt's out, the shirt tail's out, and Oswald looks suspicious. And then when he leaves the vestibule and heads up toward the Texas Theater, Brewer steps out on the sidewalk, and he looks up, and the theater's another 100 feet or so up the street. And he can see, Johnny Brewer can see Julia Postal, the ticket taker, come out of her booth, and she's standing, and they're both looking west up Jefferson Boulevard, and Oswald's in between them. And so Brewer sees Oswald slip into the theater behind Julia's back. So he walks up the street. He says, hey, did that guy buy a ticket? And she kind of half expected to see him because out of the corner of her eye, she remembers somebody approaching from that direction. And then she realizes, well, he never passed her, and he could have only gone in the theater. And so she said, well, no, he didn't buy a ticket. So Brewer went in and checked to make sure that he hadn't slipped out one of the exits. And when he was confident that he was still in there, he came back out and told her, better call the police. That might be who they're looking for. Now, by that time, he had heard, of course, on the radio that the president had been shot. And I think they had just announced that it was dead. And then Brewer also said that he had heard a report that there was a shooting of a police officer in Oak Cliff, although they didn't specify where it was. So he just thought, well, maybe it's something to do with this whole thing. And that was at 1:45 when the report went out over the radio of a suspect hiding in the Texas Theater. The cops poured in the front, they poured in the back. Johnny Brewer was up by the stage. He was, they have the exit curtain on either side of the stage. He's kind of standing behind that exit curtain. And when the cops came in the front door, they were yelling to turn up the house lights. The movie's still rolling, but they brought the house lights up a little bit. And when they did, Brewer spotted Oswald in the 5th seat, 3rd row from the back, 5th seat in from the aisle. Saw Oswald stand up, start to exit, go to the aisle to exit. Apparently saw the police pouring in the lobby and sat back down, same row, but the 2nd seat in. So that's where he was arrested. He was sitting in the 2nd seat, but originally was in the 5th seat in.
Right.
And
Right. So then at that time, so what happened when they turned up the lights?
They turn up the lights, and all of a sudden Brewer hears somebody banging on the back door, which is right up the stairs behind him next to the stage. So it's locked from the inside. So he goes, and it's a push bar. So he pushes the door, and there's a dozen cops out there, and they grab him. and they throw him up against the wall, and then they're wondering who he is. And he said he was very scared because they thought he's the suspect slipping out the back door.
Well, Brewer.
And
Brewer.
so Brewer. So he quickly explains, no, the guy's in there. I just saw him, because he had just seen him stand up, fifth seat, and sit back down. He's in there. Brown shirt, can you point him out? Yeah. So the cops all go in, they stand behind the curtain, and he points it out. Now, Nick McDonald's the guy he's pointing this out to. So Nick goes up the one aisle. There are three cops shadowing him in the other aisle. And Nick, they frisked a few people on the way up. And then they got up close to him. And Nick said that he was kind of looking at Oswald out of the corner of his eye, but he's kind of looking at this other couple that are sitting across from him. And when he got right, almost like he's going to question this other couple, he spins quickly to Oswald. He notices he's got both hands sitting in his lap. He says, "Get on your feet." Oswald stood up without being asked. Oswald brought his hands up as if surrendering. When they got about shoulder high, Nick starts to reach down like he's going to pat him down, and Oswald suddenly says, "It's all over now." And then he balled up his left hand into a fist, and he slugged McDonald right between the eyes, knocked him down with his right hand, then grabbed for the pistol in his belt. And McDonald saw that, reached up, grabbed the cylinder to keep it from turning, which you're trained to do. And then the cops are all jumping on him, so there's a big struggle. Eyewitnesses and police officers said the gun's waving around. It did snap, according to both theater patrons and police. Nick McDonald always said that the way he had grabbed the cylinder with his left hand, the webbing between his thumb and his index finger was in between the hammer and the firing pin. And so when the hammer came down, that webbing, that flesh dulled the hammer enough to not discharge the round. Now, they later said, I think somebody said, well, but there we saw a nick on the firing pin. It just didn't go off. And of course, then, everybody jumped on that, because after the police examined the rounds, nobody could see a nick. There wasn't anything that looked like a firing pin that had hit the round. But I think it was just the snap of the pistol that they heard. And but there's no question that he pulled the gun and attempted to shoot McDonald or anybody else that got in the way.
Sure. So, by the way, according to what they could find when they seized the gun that Oswald had, did it have all the bullets in the chamber? Had he?
Yeah, it was.
How many bullets were in the chamber?
It was fully reloaded, and I believe it had 3 and 3. So he had 2 different brands of ammunition: Winchester Westerns and Remington Peters. The gun had 3 of each. So 3 Winchester Westerns, 3 Remington Peters, and then in his pocket was another 5 rounds, and I believe they were all Remington Peters. Right,
and so people sometimes will make a big deal about the type of munition used and all that, but
Well, the way they describe it is there was 2 different kinds of bullets that hit Tippit. It's like no, there were 2 different brands of bullets, not 2 different kinds. It was hit with .38 caliber bullets. Now, of course, they couldn't trace the bullets to Oswald's gun like they could the revolver shells conclusively, to the exclusion of all other weapons. And the reason was because he had purchased a World War II vintage Victory model. That what they commonly did, because .38 specials were a better round, they rechambered them. Okay, so to sell these World War II vintage models, they rechambered them and then sold them to the civilian market. So what that did, the rechambering to allow the larger cartridge, is that the diameter of the .38 special bullet is just a smidge smaller than a standard .38 round. So when it went down the barrel, you would get the twist and the grooves on it, 4 lands, right twist or whatever. But it would move erratically. So the little scratches that were in it would be so erratic that even if you fired test rounds in that revolver and tried to compare them to each other, knowing that you had just fired them, you couldn't match them to each other or to the revolver. But the bullets also not only exhibited that particular behavior in terms of scratches, that they had been fired in an undersized barrel, but they also exhibited gas erosion from gases slipping around the bullet because it is undersized. So what's the bottom line? The bottom line is that the bullets could not be traced to Oswald's revolver to the exclusion of all other weapons, but they were fired in a revolver just like Oswald's. A revolver that's firing .38 specials that are undersized in an undersized barrel And so Oswald's revolver is not excluded from among those that could have fired them. And of course, then you have all the other evidence. You've got the shells that definitely were fired, that the witnesses saw him unloading, and 11 witnesses that saw him fleeing the scene. So, and not only that, but then you've got the whole arrest, right?
Sure.
Consciousness of guilt, Oswald's actions, all the suspicious behavior is what really convicts him. And then in addition to all the physical evidence, I don't think there's any question that he would have been convicted in a court of law for the murder of Officer J.D. Tippit.
Well, by the way, you mentioned that the police entered the Texas Theater from two directions. Is that right? So that they were entering from the lobby towards the back of the theater, and then by way of the emergency exit that the person from the shoe store had opened up, right? So they poured into the theater from two directions. Were they?
That's right.
I'm just wondering. I mean, was there danger that he could have run out of the theater from the?
Oh, I don't think he could have got out of there.
Right, because there were cops. They were just, at the time he was arrested, there were like a couple dozen cops.
They had sealed the front, they'd sealed the back. They were like I say, McDonald originally, accosted him, and then you had there were 3 other cops that were shadowing McDonald coming up the other. One was coming down the aisle that Oswald was in, one was in the aisle behind him, and one was in the aisle in front. And they were approaching as McDonald's ordering him to his feet. So when they grapple for the gun, those 3 cops immediately run in. So you got 4 guys on the scene immediately, and then they're yelling, and then all the other cops that are in the area, somewhere in the balcony, like Paul Bentley, they come running down there. He ends up hurting straining a ligament or something, jumping over one of the seats. But there was a whole bunch of them in the melee. And then one of the things, as soon as they got him subdued, he starts yelling, "Police brutality," and "I'm not resisting arrest." And several of the cops there, in fact, Westbrook later told Larry Sneed, an author, he says, "I don't know how there could possibly be any police brutality in a situation like that where you've got a mad dog killer that just shot a police officer in broad daylight, cold blood."
Yeah.
He says, to him, he says, I can't imagine you're not beating the hell out of him. But they didn't do, everybody said that they didn't do any more, they didn't treat him any more roughly than was needed to affect the arrest. And sometimes guys are, he's struggling, so all right, we're going to hit you a few times.
Sure, I mean, that's just how you subdue a prisoner, subdue a suspect,
Sometimes it has to be done, especially one brandishing a weapon.
Sure, absolutely. So, so then at that time, then Oswald's taken to the city jail. Where did they go with Oswald at that point?
They took him down to City Hall, which is where he eventually is shot. There's film actually of them bringing him in, and you see him passing over the very spot that he's going to be shot 48 hours later by Jack Ruby. So they bring him up. They bring him up the public elevator right into homicide and robbery, and they put him in a small interrogation room. There's films of all of that. He arrives at 2:02 because there's a clock right on hanging on a coat hanger that you can see in the film footage. And Jim Lavelle told me that he talked to Oswald for a few minutes before Captain Fritz came back. So here was the big moment for me that was, you can imagine if you're a police officer. At the same time all of this is going on, they're finding the shells in the building and they're finding this rifle. Yeah. And Roy Truly, who had encountered Oswald in that lunchroom encounter 90 seconds after the shot, they're running. He's helping a police officer, Marion Baker, get to the roof. The Baker thought the shots might have been fired from the roof. And as they pass the second floor stairwell, they see Oswald in a lunchroom. They stop him briefly, but Truly vouches for him, tells the officer, no, he's an employee, he's okay. He works here, and they continue on. Yeah. So then later, after they find the rifle and the shells and so forth, there's kind of a head count. Where is everybody? And Truly remembered Oswald because he'd just seen him, right after the shooting. Well, where's Lee? Has anybody seen him? Well, no, he's not around. And so Truly thought that was unusual. So he gets the record in Oswald's application. He didn't give his rooming house. He's living under an assumed name in Oak Cliff. But he gave the address of where Maureen is staying, Ruth Payne's house out in Irving. That was on the application. So Truly retrieves that, and he gives it to Captain Fritz. He says, I don't know if this means anything, but this boy's missing, and, I don't know if he has anything to do with it. But so Fritz takes the name. He's okay. Now Fritz was told, The sheriff wanted to talk to you. And so they go over there, and Decker says, oh, by the way, your office called. Well, what the office had called about was they had the Tippit suspect under arrest, and he was coming into City Hall. So Fritz says, okay, we'll be up in a minute. So Fritz arrives, 5 or so minutes after Lavelle has a chance to talk to Oswald. So 5 minutes after Oswald arrives, Fritz gets back there, and he says, you got the police suspect? Yeah, he's right in that interrogation room. Okay, great. We're going to talk to him in a minute. But right now, I need a couple officers to go out to this address in Irving and pick up a Lee Oswald. And the cops go, what? He goes, Lee Oswald. They go, well, Captain, we'll save you the trip. That's him in there. He's the cop killer. So you can imagine the Captain Fritz and all those police, they knew immediately, we've got the guy. Here's a guy who worked at the Texas School Book Depository. He's missing, and 45 minutes later, he shot a police officer. They're almost certain they've got the guy right then.
Wow. I think about what I always see crop up in my mind is whenever there's people talking about, no, it could have been Oswald, it wasn't him, it was somebody else. No way. Well, okay, he's innocent, right? So he was a patsy. Okay, good. Well, how come he acted so guilty?
Exactly.
He leaves the school.
Exactly. In fact,
yeah.
Well, when he leaves the book depository, right, he goes up, he jumps on the first bus that's coming, not the bus he normally would take, which would drop him at his rooming house. He grabs the first one that's going to take him it's going to drive down Marsalis instead of Beckley, and it's about 3 or 4 blocks away. So he takes the one that's most convenient. Then it gets hung up in traffic because traffic's backing up from the assassination. A woman jumps off and asks for a transfer because she's going to miss her bus at the Union Station. That gives Oswald an idea. Now, he rode public transportation religiously. He knew that a transfer off this bus will be good in Oak Cliff. I can still use it later. So he asks for a transfer, and he gets off. And he walks south to the Greyhound bus station and gets a cab. Now, you got to stop right here. Oswald, who's the most frugal person, he's making $1.25 an hour. That was minimum wage at the time in this menial job. He didn't drive, he didn't have a car, he didn't have money for a car. He rode public transportation religiously. This guy goes and gets a cab. That would be like you or I at the end of a workday going, I think I'm going to take a limousine home and order a limousine service. I mean, that's the equivalent. That's how unusual that would be.
Yeah. What was the fare between where he got off the bus and?
It was 95 cents, and he gave the guy $1. And Whaley said, William Whaley was the cab driver, said, you never forget a nickel tipper. But Oswald had him drive past his house, almost like Oswald checking to see if anybody's already there. If the cops have already figured it out and they're waiting for him, has him drop him 5 blocks south, and then he hooks it back. Runs into the room. The landlady, of course, says, oh, boy, you're in a hurry. Goes in his room. Now, she said in testimony later he was in there 3 or 4 minutes. But that's the kind of thing, how some people will say, yeah, well, how long were you there? Oh, about 5 minutes. And it turns out, no, you're there 30 seconds. 5 minutes is just a euphemism for I was there a short time.
Well, people are always,
so she said he was there 3 or 4. She said he was there 3 or 4 minutes, and people have held that number as gospel.
Well, people forget that when something happens, people don't know who the suspects are. People don't know everything's so fluid. And they hear the president was shot. At that time, I think they had already heard the president had been shot, maybe had died. And so they're in a state of shock. They've also got a house. They're taking care of chores or whatever, maybe making lunch or, cleaning up after lunch. And so it's just normal that they maybe wouldn't be, well, let me just see how many minutes he stays in there. People. Yeah. She's not paying attention. She did say he was in there long. Later, she said, well, he was in there long enough to change his jacket. Well, how long does that take? And now we know he got his gun. So let's say the gun's there. Let's say it even needs to be loaded. You could do all that in 30 seconds and be gone. So, I suspect he was in there a short period of time, not as long as she thought, but it's neither here nor there. All the evidence shows he's over on 10th Street. So he managed to get there. And I remember Bill Alexander, I interviewed him back in 1983. He was the assistant district attorney. And he said one of the things that always bothered him is that nobody saw Oswald between his rooming house and the Tippit murder scene. Nobody saw him traversing that distance. And in his mind, he says, I always thought if somebody, is double timing it, that would draw attention. Somebody would have seen him. But he said nobody saw him. And I always thought, well, but Bill,
everybody is either in watching television or listening to the radio. Nobody's out on the street. Once you heard the president was shot, this was like a seminal moment in American history, and one of the first things covered by television. So people were gravitated to the television.
Family. They're running, they're listening to the radio. They're glued. They're talking. They're not daydreaming.
Right.
They're not looking out the window to see if there's any suspects going down the street. 6 miles away from the scene of the crime.
Yeah.
Honey, let's check and see if there's any suspects out there. Have you seen anybody? That doesn't happen. So now we go to the animation that you did when you were involved in doing the work with for the documentary. I take it was a documentary, right?
Yeah, the Peter Jennings Beyond Conspiracy, the Kennedy assassination Beyond Conspiracy. It was in 2003. So
tell us about that. Tell us about what you recreated with the animation. What came out of it all? And
well, I had actually done that animation before Jennings. It was years before Jennings was even aware of that. Back in 1993, I came up with the idea of doing it. I actually thought of this idea back in the early 80s, and what I'd been researching the assassination since 1975. And the Zapruder film was always jerky and jumpy, and you couldn't really tell what was going on. And it occurred to me, I was an single frame animation guy since I was 8 years old, with an 8mm movie camera and that sort of thing. And it occurred to me, I thought, I could get a couple of friends to sit in 2 folding chairs. One could be Kennedy, one could be Conley. And then I would put the camera on a tripod. This was my idea. And then I would pose them, and I would match them I would look at a single frame editor that I had, and I would pose them to match Kennedy and Conley's movements, and I would take a single frame. In other words, I would have these actors acting out, frame by frame. And then it would be like an animation that you could then play back. But because the camera would be rock steady, you could finally see in real time what Kennedy and Conley are doing without all the camera shakiness. Now, I never ended up doing that. But then, fast forward, 13 years later. So in 1993, I had gotten into the computer animation desktop business in 1990. And by 93, had produced a thing called Robo Junior, which was one of the first animated cartoons. And that led to doing the M&Ms and a lot of other things.
Sure.
But I was doing the Kennedy assassination research on the side, and it occurred to me, I could use this program to recreate the Zapruder film. I could do something that hadn't ever been done before. It would be better than sitting 2 friends in a folding chair, because I would be able to project. The program allowed you to bring in each Zapruder frame, and like a transparency, you could look through it, and I could align that with a computer model. And so the idea was,
I built a model of the
I'd build a computer model faithful to the scene of the shooting, a car faithful to the size of the car and so forth, and then figures to represent Kennedy and Conley. And then basically I would be able to pose these figures to match each frame of the Zapruder film. And it was only 486 frames, I say only. But I thought, okay, it's not like an infinite number of frames. There's a finite number, and it might take a while, but it's doable. So it took me about 6 weeks every day, 8 hours a day, to do 20 frames or 30 frames, and I worked my way through it.
Yeah.
And when I got done, I remember it was a Wednesday night. I don't know why this sticks in my mind, but it was a Wednesday night at 11 o'clock. Now, maybe I'm misremembering that like we were talking earlier. Maybe it was 10 o'clock and it was a Tuesday night, but whatever. I've always told the story this way, so I'm going to keep telling it. It was a Wednesday night at 11 o'clock, and I remember I had just enough done of the model that I thought, I could do a trajectory for the single bullet there. I've got enough done to see where it goes. And, of course, that was one of the whole points of doing this. So I hooked up the trajectory line to Conley, and I lined it up to the, went to the frame, which he supposedly hit, that sequence 223, 224. And I was like blown away because it went right back. It passed right through Kennedy, right through his throat and his back, and right back up through the 6th floor sniper's nest window. And I really was shocked because I'd been reading conspiracy stuff all that time. I thought I was going to show it going somewhere else, like the Dell Tech building or something. Right, and then, of course, over the next months, you refine it and so forth, and make sure that you're right, and it wasn't just a fluke,
By the way, there's a lot. This is fascinating. What was the angle of incidence between the window and JF Kennedy's back, or the spot
Oh,
where
I have no idea. I mean, I would have to look. You know, you have to remember, I'm a visual artist. I'm doing this. I'm matching these frames, the model, to match the film, and then I can go back in and fish out an angle. You know, because first you got to take into account. All right, now the street's at an angle. What angle are we talking about? Relative to the world, or relative to the street, or relative to the car, which is on an angle? You know, there's all these other things. I went in and fished out angles and looked at what the Warren Commission came up with, and it's like it was so close as to.
Within the margin of error.
I might have been off, 2/10 of what it didn't matter. The margin of error in the model and in my placing and the method I used could have easily introduced that. So it was close enough. I mean, it basically was, and then that's the thing, of course. I didn't really do anything different other than make a visual that illustrated what the Warren Commission had found out. And if you took the film out of it, take that out of the equation, and just look at the forensics, the bullets were all fired from the rifle found in that building. The shells are under that window.
Right.
So
sure.
I didn't really prove anything other than it made an interesting visual thing. So anyway, in '93, I started it. I finished it in '95. I thought, wow, the research community, because at that time the internet was just getting going, and I thought this so-called research community, they're going to be fascinated by this. In fact, I had a little Sony Walkman 8mm video player, and I took it to the Ask conference in Chicago, and I showed it to Robert Groden, and he was blown away, of course. And he goes, wow, you mean you could put a camera where the babushka lady was standing and see what her film might have shown? I go, yep. You can put a camera behind the grassy knoll. Yes. You could put a camera in the sniper's nest window. Mm-hmm. You can put it on any building. Yes, I can put it where any eye window. He goes, this is the greatest advance in science in the Kennedy assassination ever. And then he found out, a few weeks later that I concluded that it was all one gunman from the 6th floor, and that was the end of that. It was now no longer the greatest scientific advance in history.
Oh my gosh! Yeah,
but I saw the video, a VHS video of it in '95. Whatever, 50 or so people bought it, and it was 10 sequences, and the figures were new. It was very rudimentary, but it basically was the answer. And I thought anybody that's really interested in this will be fascinated by that. And some people embraced it, and some people. The people that criticized it at first, they said, well, he just fudged it. He just manipulated the people so that they matched the film, and then it went back through the window. And I thought, yeah, but if I did that and it still matches the film, then it's still legitimate, right? Right? I mean, that's the whole point. Yeah. If I fudged it, in other words, if I just aligned them so it worked, but it still matches the film, how's that possible? Unless it really happened that way. I mean, so the arguments, I've heard so many silly arguments, and there's whole YouTube videos out there, websites dedicated to denigrating my work and claiming it's just a cartoon and what did I really know? And here's proof of why he moved the chair and why he resized the figures. And it's like, it's just all such nonsense. Yeah, sure. And none of them have ever come here and actually seen what I did, I mean, and the people that have, well, I had Z-Axis Corporation let me just wrap this up as far as the Peter Jennings thing. So 10 years later, the Jennings Group, it's the 40th anniversary, it's 2003, and they were looking for a new angle on the Kennedy case, something they might be able to do a documentary. They're kind of nosing around for a story. And a friend of mine, Gus Russo, who was actually a producer working with the Peter Jennings Group, he says, I know a guy that's got this computer recreation. And they went, we'll buy it. They hadn't even seen it. They didn't even know what he's talking about. But anyway, so they flew me to New York, and I did an 8-hour dog and pony show. And I basically laid out the whole thing and showed it. Here's what I did. Here's the results. Well, they were flabbergasted, and they ended up making it the anchor of the show. And then they decided, well, maybe we better vet this guy, make sure that, he's not just, he's bamboozled us. So they were looking around, and they got Z-Axis Corporation, which is one of the leading computer forensic animation companies that do demonstrative evidence for courtrooms. They did the Oklahoma City bombing. They did the Twin Towers. So they flew a couple of guys up to my house. I walked through the whole thing for them. They took measurements off the actual model, and then they ended up writing a 3-page report saying not only did I do what they would have done for a courtroom presentation, but I went way beyond that. I covered my bases so many different ways. They said there's absolutely solid what I had done, and the conclusions were justified and exactly what they would have concluded, using the same method. So I was very proud of that. It ended up being nominated for an Emmy for outstanding graphic design, and although you never know on those award shows, but I ended up winning, and so that was great. It kind of justified the whole thing.
Well, great. Well, congratulations, a little belatedly, but
Well, that's all right. Thank you very much. Always nice to get a compliment.
Absolutely. So then, looking at the forensics issue, and I know you told me frankly that you're not a ballistics expert, but
No, but I've had lunch with one, a really good one, Luke Haig and his son Michael. These guys are spectacular, and they've done more work with this particular round, which is an unusual round, the 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Carcano round, and done more forensic testing with it. And but anyway, so I'm not an expert, but I do rely on experts.
And then you discussed the JFK assassination thoroughly, would you say, with them?
Oh yeah, and they've done it all, and they've done a lot of work on their own too. They did a lot of stuff on their own. But I met them and we became friends, and I was happy to promote the work they were doing, and their work has appeared in all kinds of forensic journals. I mean, they don't need me, that's for sure. But it's certainly eye-opening stuff that they've done as far as tests and so forth that confirm the basics of what we know. Why the single bullet could pass through two people, cause 7 wounds, and still emerge in a relatively, it's not pristine, but it's a relatively looks pristine on, of course it's flattened a little bit, kind of, and bent a little like a banana. But, and it turns out that bullet looks that way because of its ballistic properties and that are unique to it. And so, it takes all the mystery out of, why can this bullet do this? But then when it hits his head, it literally explodes, Well, you got two different surfaces. One's hitting soft tissue, and the other one is hitting, hard skull bone. So,
sure.
But
sure,
anyway.
which can have different. Sure. And so, we had I interviewed James Curtis Jenkins, which of course brings up, this topic of, he claimed, because he was there at the autopsy, the last surviving member of the JFK autopsy team from Bethesda Naval Hospital, and he was a med tech or a Navy medical corpsman there present, and he claimed that then they had somebody from the Army, Dr. Pierre Fink, who was from I forget the name of the organization, but basically it was a unit that had to do with, I think it was the battlefield wound analysis department, the Pentagon, and he was there kind of consulting with the autopsy, because you had naval branch physicians there. And Jim claimed that the back wound did not project through to his neck, and I just wonder if you have anything to say about that. Maybe that's something that you've never heard before. Maybe you have. You have any comment about that?
I've read all the, the House Select, where the AARB released, all the, thousands of pages of medical files, right? Which basically summed up the case up to that point. And I ordered a set of those, and I went through and I laid out all the documentation and re-keyed it in chronological order. It was something I learned when I did the Tippit book. When you lay stuff out in chronological order, you start to suddenly see why things happened a certain way, and discrepancies that pop up, you can see, oh, that's because, the guy came in late or whatever, So I did that with all the medical evidence. I know there was, they talked about putting a probe through the body and so forth.
Exactly, to the back.
And they talked about photos being taken of the probe, then those photos are gone and so forth. And we know that Robert Kennedy had control of a lot of the autopsy materials, both the brain and the specimen and so forth. And so some of that stuff probably got deep-sixed, because of, they just didn't want pictures existing like that. Although it's hard to believe you would keep some of the gory ones that we do have and get rid of these other ones. But in any event, not having been there, I can't say other than I know what I read, and I know that there's discrepancies amongst, the medical people, the various people that have looked at it. But I tend to, what I used for my animation was, okay, give me the bottom line. Were there any bullet wounds in the head besides the rear? Now, Larry Sturtevant, a wounds ballistic expert, wrote a great book called the Jfk Myths, and he builds a pretty solid case. I didn't believe it for a long time because I always thought, okay, the House Select Committee, the cowlick entrance wound, I just assumed, all right, the early guys who made a mistake, it was actually higher in the cowlick. But he actually goes through all that and builds a case that the lower wound is actually correct, okay, over the cowlick. Now, but bottom line, I guess what I'm saying is whether it's the cowlick or the one above the occipital protuberance, they're both in the back of the head. That's all that matters. That's all that I was interested in. And no one has ever disputed that the entrance wound was in the back of the head. Now, you may argue he's hit by a second bullet that enters the large opening that is caused by the bullet in the back of the head, and there's no evidence. Well, that can't have come, as I showed you in the animation, from the so-called grassy knoll, because that would have been a perpendicular shot, literally. Kennedy's head in relation to the fence where that shot supposedly was fired, and we've been heard from Groden and all these people for years, is perpendicular. That trajectory line would be perpendicular to Kennedy's head. In other words, there would have to be either an exit wound on the left side of his skull and or traces of fragments left in the left hemisphere of his brain. And the x-rays show there aren't. So we know for a fact that whatever happened, it didn't cross the left of the brain, and therefore there is no shot from the so-called grassy knoll. Now, in my animation, I said, well, now if you had a tangential shot that strikes on the right side, somehow kind of grazes across the right side and exits on the lower right side, which is, if you read all the conspiracy talk about this, you'll see that the theory keeps changing as time goes on. So as roadblocks come up, well, that couldn't have happened. Well, then they change it. Okay, then this happened. So in other words, it's still a conspiracy, but we keep moving where the shooter is. So anyway, so I did a cone, trajectory cone. All right, let's assume Groden's correct. There are people that believe that there's a tangential shot that strikes the right front and exits the lower right rear. Where would that come from based on Kennedy's head at the time that the shot happens? And it turns out, well, it's such a large area because there is no true trajectory. You just create this giant error cone that it basically would encompass the entire south end of the grassy knoll. But what it definitely did is it eliminated the infamous stockade fence and grassy knoll area, that entire right side of the car and the entire overpass, as being a source of the shot. You would have to, if you believe that, you would have to say, well, it came from the south grassy knoll. And when I came to that conclusion, I told a friend of mine, I said, you watch. Once I say this, they're going to use Dale Myers as proof that the shot came from the south grassy knoll. And now if you go online, you'll see all kinds of theories. Some of them point to my work, but now they're saying, oh, it's the south grassy knoll. Well, of course they are, because the other one's eliminated. But that just goes with the territory.
Absolutely.
Bottom line is in terms of the ballistics, all of the fragments that were found in the car were fired from Oswald's rifle, to the exclusion of all other weapons on the planet. All of the shots were fired from behind. In other words, the entrance wound in the back of the president's upper right back or lower neck. People want, they want to move that wound around. It doesn't matter. That's the entrance wound. So all the shots are coming from behind that hit anybody in the car. And of course, the big thing with the single bullet theory is that even if you eliminate, take my animation away and just say, all right, so a bullet passes through JFK's throat, neck, upper right back area, and exits his throat. And frankly, based on the ballistics, the speed of that round, it's hard to believe Jenkins when he says that bullet just hit his back and stopped. It's just not possible.
Yeah, I thought that too. My question is about the
ballistic standpoint.
What was the velocity of that bullet? I confuse meters per
I
second.
think it's like 1,900 feet per second, 1920, something like that, 1,900 feet per second. And it leaves the muzzle. And once it passed through the 4 to 6 inches of Kennedy's upper right back throat area, it would still be moving, according to Luke Hagen, his son, at about 1,800 feet per second. So it hasn't lost very much velocity at all. And one thing they did show absolutely conclusively is that even though a bullet will a round like that will pass through up to, and they showed where they fired through wood and stuff, where it just maintains a straight trajectory. Once it exits, it begins to yaw. So it begins to tumble. And the wound that hit Conley, in the back was elongated, so it was tumbling. Didn't come in from an angle. I know some people made that argument for a lot of years, but they proved, the Haig boys proved that that's not possible either. The bullet was elongated, the wound was elongated because the round had begun to tumble. So you got to conclude that, all right, so Conley is hit by a round that has hit something else, okay? And the president's round goes through his throat. Where did it go? Right? Because that's the first question. Did it hit anything in the car? Is there a round still moving at 1,800 feet per second would have put a hole in steel? So there'd be a hole in the floorboard of the car or through glass. There was none. And so then the question became, and this is how the single bullet theory was born. I've heard people say, and maybe I'm misremembering this, but I've heard people lately say that it was when they discovered James Tagg had been wounded, they realized, well, there's too many bullets and they had to come up with something. And my recollection is, I believe it always was, no, they were trying to answer the question. It wasn't about the timing, it's what happened to the bullet. The bullet passes through the president. Where did it go? It's got to hit the car or somebody in it. And it turns out it didn't hit the car. Was there anybody wounded in the car? Yes. Conley. Oh, okay. Where was he sitting? Right in front of the president. Come on. It's a done deal.
Sure. So, one other
so
question I want to ask you.
That'd be, yeah, go ahead.
Right. No, and I was going to say, you continue. It's about you, not about me. What were you going to say?
No. All I was going to say is it's a done deal. You've got the elongated entrance wound in Conley's back, and of course, once it enters his body, all bets are off. It's like when you drop a penny into water, right? It flutters, right? It doesn't create a straight line. So this thing kind of tunnels around. It kind of follows the rib, kind of tunnels around the outside of the rib, and as it pushes that fifth rib, it actually snaps it in the back, exits at his chest, and then enters the back of his right wrist, exits, and ends up over in the left thigh, but not deep enough to hit bone. So apparently, and nobody really knows, but apparently it works its way out of his leg, from just moving the leg around, and ends up on the stretcher. Now, there's 1,000,001 reasons why, they can point. Well, the guy remembered it as being a pointed bullet, and the guy remembered, it was actually found on the other guy's stretcher. And, I've read all the, we've waited for 50 years through all the supposed theories and so forth. But the bottom line is that when you brush all that aside, you're still left with the basic question: what happened to the bullet that went through Kennedy? It had to hit Conley. It had to. It's got nowhere else to go.
Right, sure. And he's very close to him. So now, the other thing is this, is that just as you said, there were witnesses who said that Oswald, getting back to J.D. Tippit and his shooting, that there were witnesses saying he was going west and others saying he was going east, and they could both be right. I'm wondering if it's possible that both could be right concerning this whole issue of the head trauma from the shot to the head. And my question is that people say, okay, sure, classical ballistics. If it goes in one spot of your body, small, and it forms a cone-shaped force towards the exit wound, which is big. So you have this huge exit wound and this relatively small entrance wound. Well, is it possible? And I'm wondering what these forensics, these father and son said. What was their name again, by the way?
Luke and Michael Haig.
Okay. Did the Haigs?
H-A-A-G. Yeah.
Okay. Did the Haigs at any point talk about the head wound? Because what they must have. Because when I spoke to Jim Jenkins, I spoke to him many times, and basically what comes out of it is that it was such a destructive encounter with the cranium that it kind of formed. It didn't blow off the whole entire area of his head. Parts of it, yes, but the scalp remained attached. There was, I guess you could call it fracturing that took place, which is normal. If you get hit in your femur by a bullet, well, it could fracture it. It could break it. It could be maybe, I don't know, maybe a compound fracture. But the idea is that it caused such immense damage that I'm wondering if it's consistent with a wound that, began to open up, the back and the side of his head, such that, in effect, you could open up. I think they used the term refract the scalp, and lift it up and then put it back down again. When you put it back down again, it didn't look that bad, but of course, there was a massive amount of loss of tissue, bone, and gray matter and blood. So I'm wondering if it's conceivable that somehow both could be right. That it's consistent with a wound from the rear and an exit, to the right side of his head, but it did a tremendous amount of damage along the way. Of course, in the Zapruder film, you look at it, it's not extremely close. It was taken from a distance of, 20 meters, maybe 20 yards. But, was there, in your opinion, is it possible that there was damage that could have been done to the structure of the brain such that it basically, in effect, disintegrated along the line of fire where the bullet entered and exited, whereby you had massive amount of damage throughout? I don't know. Does that make any sense?
So you're suggesting that he's hit with a second shot, but the evidence of that shot is destroyed by the first one? Well, no. Are you suggesting a second shot, or you're just talking about the way the head moved?
No. What I'm saying is that, if the bullet hits the back, let's say the Warren Commission is right, the bullet hits the back of President Kennedy's head, and it exits the right temple, near the right temple. Along the way, is it conceivable that it did just massive damage to the back and the right side of the skull, such that it could have opened up basically a tremendous wound, but that refracted back, so that you could, just like Jim Jenkins said, it lifted up, was very big, and then you could put back into place, and it wasn't quite as bad. You look at it, it was a massive gaping wound.
I know what you're talking about now. Yeah. Well, they even said, Humes was saying that the skull was actually falling apart in their hands. The hole was getting bigger as they were handling the head. So you had the fractures, and the X-rays show this throughout the skull, and then the scalp is holding that together. And they even said his head, not to get totally gross here, but the head was elongated, right? It's changing shape because he basically smashed the skull, and the only thing really holding it together is the scalp. And so you have this, I would read Larry Sturtevant's book, the Jfk Myths, because he's a wound ballistics expert. And so he knows about the properties of what would happen to human flesh from the bullet. And then, of course, the Haig brothers are familiar with the ballistic effects, what you would expect to see. But I think between the two of them, the bullet enters, makes a small hole, builds up this tremendous amount of pressure along the path that is cone-shaped. And when the bullet exits, it sort of blows out the portion in between those 2 points. And so even in Kennedy's case, you had a head, what they call the head flap, where a piece of skull kind of can flap forward. And you actually see this in the Zapruder film, where it is forward. And in the autopsy photos, it's back in place because it's closed up. So depending on when you look at the wound, either those pieces can be peeled open and you're seeing a very large hole, or they're back together and you're not seeing as much damage. And of course, the skull could be, we know it was fractured in many places because the X-rays show that. So, but as far as the ballistic evidence in the X-rays, there are no metal fragments that are left of a line of center. When you look at the frontal, from a frontal perspective, all of the fragments are on the right side of the skull. So we know that the bullet passed back to front. On the right side of the skull, and that nothing hit on the other side. Now, in terms of the president's head moving and so forth, this was the main thing I found interesting when I was matching up the head in my model to those Zapruder frames. His head bobs forward. Now, I know there's Josiah Thompson's got a book coming out this fall, where initially, back in 6 Seconds in Dallas, one of the premier books, and one of the books that got me interested in this case to begin with, was that the president's head moves forward supposedly 2 inches. And then you had somebody come along years later and say, no, that was just a artifact of the blurring, and his head actually doesn't move forward at all. And but in matching the model, no, the head bobs forward about 2 inches. There's no question about it. The blur is not hiding that. It is there. And in fact, forget the blurred frame of 313. Just go to 314. You can see that the head is forward of the position it was at 312. And the only way for it to be forward at 314 is it had to move forward during 313. And it actually does move forward, and it's still in that position at 314. But my main point, though, was that the head beginning to move back, and it starts to move back at 314, 15, 16. At 15/16, the head is back in its original position that it was, in terms of the back of the head, at 312. In other words, the head bobs forward from a bullet at 312, 313, bobs forward. But it takes the next 2 or 3 frames for it to recover that same distance. So that tells you that whatever force struck the head at 312, which we know is a bullet because we can see its effects at 313, we know that whatever that force was, the force, whatever it is, that's causing the head and body to move backward and to the left has to be a lesser force. So when that film was first shown on TV, people, all they had ever seen of people being shot were in Hollywood movies where they'd hook up guide wires and a guy would take a shotgun blast and he would fly across the room. So people had it in their head of how they thought a human body would react when it's shot. And of course, thank God we don't do experiments where we shoot people just to see what it looks like on film. So there's really, you could do a dozen guys, right? You could have a dozen films of a dozen people being shot, and so they're all going to react different. But it's all going to move within the realm of what's physiologically possible. And again, I'm not a medical expert, but those that are, and physicists who are, have said that the movement of the president back and to the left is consistent with a neurological spasm, if you will, where the body goes rigid from the sudden impact to the brain, the sudden shutting off of all those systems, and that it's inconsistent, as I would say, based on just what I did, with the bullet being driven. You can't drive a body with a bullet. A piece of lead that small can only move a head. In this case, they said about 2 inches, which is what you see in that first moment. Right. So the body flying back into the left, that's not being driven back by a bullet because bullets don't do that. But we do know that the human body does go through a muscular, spasmatic, if you will, reaction to being struck. And, I guess I've never taken it beyond that because I always thought I'm satisfied. Some people aren't. That's not enough for them. But for me, yeah, sure. I'm satisfied.
Sure. So then, and then, of course, the famous scene, Jacqueline Kennedy getting on the back of the rear back of the car, above the trunk. Supposedly there was a piece of cranium or gray matter that went over there, and she was bringing it back.
Well, that's what Clint Hill said, and he was close enough to see. So I've got no reason to dispute that.
Sure. Okay. Great. So then, well, you did this 3D animation. You wrote the book about J.D. Tippit. Is there anything else that's come out that you consider interesting evidence that you didn't know about when you wrote with malice?
There's always stuff. There's always stuff that, little tidbits that you kind of dot the I and cross the T. So, I did update the book. Originally it was published in 98, and then I did a 50-year update in 2013, which largely was the Tippit family story, because in that intervening period, I got to know the family. When I say the family, I mean JD's brothers, sisters, cousins, friends.
When did that happen? Was that in after the 50th anniversary?
What was?
That you got to know the brothers and the siblings?
No, in 98, in 98, after the book was published, one of his nieces posted a review on Amazon, and at that time they actually posted email addresses, and they had her return email address, and I contacted her, and that opened the door. And over the next 15 years, I got to know them, went down, stayed with them. I was embraced by them ultimately. They made me their family historian, if you will.
Oh my gosh.
Gave me access to friends, family, photographs. You know, there weren't a lot of photographs that they had of JD. You know, he grew up, it was a Depression era farm. Nobody had a camera. And if they did,
sure.
you know, it was a cousin come over, he got a picture, and you maybe you never saw the photo. So,
Yeah, sure.
but after the fact, they said that they realized years later that they didn't have that many pictures of him growing up. I'm sure his wife and kids, you know, because JD did buy a home movie camera, and there were home movies that he and his wife had. But like I say, I got to know the family, his brothers and sisters, siblings and friends, and the extended family on that side, not her and her kids. It was more the other side of the family. But they were able to give me a real good picture of him as a person. And so one of their, and let me say this as a sidebar, contacting me brought closure to them. I found this out later. They actually had never dealt with this for many years. And the book became a catalyst. Now, before that, they had vowed never to talk to conspiracy people because initially they would talk to people and they would just take their story and twist it and ruin it. And they, at one point,
he was involved in something nefarious. And
well, you're charging him with the murder of being an accessory of the fact in a murder that there is no statute of limitations. I mean, it's an absolute irresponsible charge to make against anybody. And of course, if you go on these conspiracy sites, they're charging all kinds of people now. Conveniently, they're all dead. It's curious how while they're alive, they don't make the charge, but now that they're dead, they're free game. So, but the contact with them, the thing I'm most proud of, it helped bring closure, something I didn't expect, but it brought closure for them to deal with the case and in a way it ingratiated me to the family. And I've been very proud to help them and helped him get a plaque put out by his boyhood home out in, Texas historic plaque out there, and just help them in any way I can. Restore photos, did all kinds of stuff for him.
Sure.
That's not to pat myself on the back. It's just that's what happened. And so
you
anyway,
became a very important project, and it's interesting. And so go ahead.
They always said that they wanted, they wished that JD's story had been in the original book, and I thought, well, for the 50th anniversary, I'll knock out another limited edition and I'll put it in there. And I had a few other things I could add to the rest of the story that had come out since then. And I thought, yeah, I'll do an update, and I'll do it for them. And so I did that, and that's what the 2013 book includes. 150 pages of the family story, photographs, family photographs that they let me use and so forth. And it was all designed to, so that the true story
picture could be had,
could be told
of him. Right.
What's
so,
that?
and just wondering. I mean, no. So I was going to say it gave a complete picture of who J.D. Tippit was, and beyond just that, a guy who got shot and died. The president did. So, I'm surprised. I mean, or a little bit. I wonder, did J.D.'s widow ever get a copy of the book? Did she find out about the scholarship and the fact that I think she knew about the plaque being put up, right?
Well, there was a plaque. There was a second. Well, she came out to the one we dedicated. She came out there and brought in the kids and everybody, and I met her out there. And we didn't have anything to do with the Oak Cliff plaque at 10th and Patton. That was somebody else completely. The Oak Cliff Foundation was responsible for that. So, no, she was. They made her aware of the '98 book. I don't know that she ever saw the 2013 book, but I did it for the brothers and sisters rather than necessarily her. Although I think she would. I guess I don't know what she would do with the second book. She didn't care for the first one because it included the tale of the waitress, and I think, and this is just me speculating because I don't know, but I think that she thought that I was responsible for putting that story in print, when in fact, no, I was addressing what Henry Hurt wrote and what other books and what she testified to the House Select Committee. I was simply addressing the story that was already out there. I think she held it
story was, what was the importance of the waitress? What was that about?
Well, there was no importance to it. That was the point. What conspiracy theorists tried to turn it into was an alibi for Oswald. you think there's no other suspect that could have gunned down JD? Maybe it was this waitress's husband, so, so they built up, they had absolutely no evidence, and they just built up a lot of innuendo and supposition. And so then, to do a thorough book on the Tippit murder, well, you got to deal. That was one of the prime things conspiracy people were using to hammer that, to get Oswald off. So you had to deal with it. I had to deal with it. You couldn't ignore it. So I dealt with it, and by investigating it and trying to figure out, all right, did she live over there, and so forth and so on. And it turned out it was nothing but a red herring that actually was made up.
Yes.
Completely
How
made
many
up
red
by
herrings
another.
are there? Dale,
But this one was made up by a well-known conspiracy researcher from that period who was considered the Tippit expert, made that story up. And I went all the way around the barn with it. And all through all of his sources, I went all the way around, and I come back to the beginning, and it turned out, no, he was the source of the whole damn thing.
Oh, my gosh. All right,
So
well, listen,
what a waste of time. But anyway.
Wow, amazing. How many, this is the big question is, how many red herrings are there associated with the Kennedy Tippit shootings?
Almost all of it is red herrings.
Oh my gosh. Anyway, Dale, listen, thanks a lot, Dale Myers, Quorum Radio. The book, of course, is With Malice, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Murder of Officer J.D. Tippit, available on Amazon. Any other places can you get it? Goodreads or Barnes & Noble?
You can go to oakcliffpress.com, which is my publishing arm, and you can get it directly through me. It's probably easier with Amazon because they can ship it a lot cheaper than I can, and I get the copies to them, and then they're able to distribute. So that's probably the easiest way.
But aren't you able, if they get us through Oak Cliff Press, aren't you able to sign it?
Well, that's the thing. If you want a signed copy, I can sign it if you get it through Oak Cliff Press. Otherwise, the ones that you get from Amazon, they're not signed. There's no way for me to intercept that and sign it. So.
No, of course not. Okay, well, great. Well, listen, Dale, thanks a million again for this interview on Quorum Radio, and we look forward to further conversations in the future, and you be well.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. You had some great questions. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Likewise, mutual. Okay, thanks a million, Dale. You have a great day.
Sure thing. Okay.
Bye-bye.